Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Gaming History. Today we're going to be talking about the story of Space Invaders. Now you may be wondering, what's up with the hat? Well, the rats got the hat. They ate it. But I was given this. Now, I've been in this room for 2 whole months. The people who make me make these videos have been keeping me in silence for about 2 months. But they decided to have me make some more videos. So here I am making another video because they decided to have me make more videos. So let's begin. Space Invaders is a 1978 shoot-'em-up game released by the game company known as Taito and developed by them in Japan on April 19th, 1978. It was later re-released internationally by Midway Manufacturing in November of 1978. The game was created by a man known as Tomohiro Nagashado, and he came up with the idea after the success of Atari's Pong in 1976, as it was so successful both in America and in Japan that it spawned many clones and remakes. And the space theme for the game came from a variety of inspirations, such as War of the Worlds, the 1974 anime known as the Space Battleship Yamamoto, and a 1977 magazine feature covering the recently released movie known as Star Wars. These ideas all came together to come up with the idea of shooting aliens that descended down on you while you hid behind 3 bunkers. So now, most video games at this time had timers, and when these timers ran out, the game was over. You could put in more quarters to get more time on the game, but typically games at this time were time limited. But he decided to scrap this and instead make the timer the fact that the aliens scroll down, go down, down, down towards you, making this his version of the timer. Now, the game was originally going to be titled Space Monsters, but was later changed to Space Invaders by Superiors. Now, upon its April 1938 release by Taito, there were 2 versions made of it, a cocktail version and an upright version. The cocktail version had you sitting down, and these were labeled as TT Space Invaders, signify tabletop, as you had to sit down on it. And upon its release, it was extremely successful. The game was so successful, in fact, it was blamed for a 100 yen shortage that took place that year. Though this was not the cause of it. It was simply the fact that it didn't mint enough 100 yen. But it was so successful, in fact, that they blamed it. And it was also so successful to the point that there was even a song made about it in 1979. And multiple businesses opened up with the sole arcade game being Space Invaders. These were typically known as Space Invader houses or Space Invader parlors. But for years, there were businesses solely running on the fact that they had many Space Invaders arcade machines. Now, in November of 1978, of course, it was re-released internationally, including, of course, America, by Midway Manufacturing, where it was also extremely successful here in the United States of America. And by the end of the year, in Japan alone, it had sold over 100,000 cabinets and continued to sell hundreds of thousands more for the following years. And Space Invaders went on to become the highest selling video game for 3 years straight as well. And over the years, and eventually went on to make millions upon millions of dollars. Now, billions is adjusted for inflation. Yeah, it was that successful. Now, Taito had released a couple of video games before the release of Space Invaders, but none of them were very successful and didn't do so well. So this was their first true big success at the time, as it was, of course, a massive success, making millions out of billions if you adjust for inflation. And in 1979, there was a sequel, Space Invaders Part 2. This brought in color, as the game was really just green, but this brought in colors like red and other colors. And it even had cutscenes as well. This was 1 year before even Pac-Man came out. These cutscenes were very basic. At Pac-Man's cutscenes were much more animated, much more cartoony-like, and these were much more rigid and simplistic, but still, it had cutscenes. And this was very advanced for 1979, and it went on to spawn multiple remakes, sequels, and re-releases. Now, Space Invaders was later released on March 10th, 1980, onto the Atari Video Computer System. The Atari Video Computer System was later known as the 2600. Now, initially, the Atari actually didn't do that well for its first few years. it wasn't doing all that great. But what Space Invaders came out for, it was first of all the console's first big game, the first killer app as they would call it nowadays. But it was massively successful, just like in the arcades for home consoles. As by 1980, Space Invaders was still absolutely massive, as it even got its own remakes and knockoffs, just like the breakout that started it, Atari, as hundreds of companies were making their own remakes, knockoffs, and just any sort of it. Some were slightly original, most of them were just recolored or just a retiled version of Space Invaders. But the Atari 2600 version was a massive success and helped the Atari as well, of course, Taito. Now, and went on to become the packing game up until 1982 when it was replaced by Pac-Man, which also itself was a massive success. As Space Invaders happened just at the same time as the golden age of video games began, which gave us games like Galaga, Galaxian, Pac-Man, of course, Donkey Kong, and a variety of others. And of course, the Space Invaders has been ported to an endless amount of systems. Examples include, of course, home consoles, computers, dedicated home consoles, which were very popular back then, like the aforementioned Pong consoles, which we talked about in earlier videos. So, calculators, watches, LCD versions. So it was everywhere, yes, because calculator video games were a thing. Back in the 80s and stuff, they used to make calculators that had video games installed into it, and one of them was Space Invaders, or at least a Space Invaders clone. The game was absolutely massively successful and spawned an endless amount, and has been a cultural phenomenon. It's considered, and it has become a pop culture icon. It's probably the earliest well-known, recognized game. Many people, average people, don't know Pong, or at least will recognize it, but it's the first video game to have truly recognizable characters. Space Invaders characters are recognizable. If you see them, you go, that's from Space Invaders. Even Pong, which was a massive success up until then, and kind of knocked it off, doesn't really have recognizable characters because they're just paddles and a ball. But Space Invaders was the first recognizable video game. It was absolutely massive, and you can recognize them even if you have ever played the game and just only have basic knowledge of it. But yeah, it went on. One simple game went on to become a massive success and ingrained itself into pop culture, and its characters are still recognized to this day, or at least its aliens are. So I hope you all had a good time. Please like and subscribe if you feel like it. That's all I really got to say, ladies and gentlemen. So I'll see you around. I'm gonna go seal up the wall where the rats are, so they don't eat this hat. That was a good hat. See ya.